It might seem quite odd how almost all totalitarian ideologies seem to, in the modern day, have their roots in the Enlightenment. Almost all justify themselves from a sort of totalizing reason, from the National Socialists in Germany to Stalin and his international socialists in the form of the Soviet Union. But this does come from the Enlightenment, and it comes from two of the three children of the Enlightenment. The three children of the Enlightenment were English liberalism, which is not totalitarian, fascism, and communism or socialism. It's often said that after communism or socialism doesn't work, a communist or socialist system will gravitate towards fascism. This is what happened in Mussolini's Italy, and this is what happened in Germany, where you hear about a party called the National Socialists being a fascist party or a Nazi party rather than a communist or socialist party. Though if you read their manifesto, it will read very similarly to many modern socialist parties, for the simple reason that they seem to be further along in the process of thought that gave rise to socialism. And socialism is something which existed before Marx put it into specific words in the Communist Manifesto. It's something which, as an idea, has its roots in the Enlightenment and its type of reason in the Enlightenment which rejects that which is outside of what it can understand and which deems itself to have an omnipotent and omniscient type of view of the world, that it has all power and that it can gain all power and that it is able to have knowledge of all things, which is not actually possible and which is usually why socialism and fascism tend to fail. It's often said, in fact, that one of the things which prevented the National Socialists from conquering the world was their inability to secure enough oil and to control oil streams and things like that in the way that they could have done to actually complete their conquest of the known world. And many totalitarians and many people who want world conquest often don't notice a specific small thing which can prevent them. Another thing which they didn't predict was Winston Churchill having had very warm relations with the aristocracy in Great Britain. They didn't expect to have Churchill come storming in and change things. In the case of socialism, they think that they can control an economy entirely from a central command, and unfortunately or fortunately, that's just not possible. You can't replace the organic telltale sign of price. And as countries discover when they start flooding markets with excess cash, as America is even discovering now with their prices of everything going up as they print more and more US dollars, when you try to control things like a global economy, you just simply can't. And on the position of money, money simply represents what can be bought with the money. If you put more money in, the money simply becomes worth less unless you also create more productivity from it, which is why Spain, when they conquered the Americas, in fact, while bringing more resources in, more things which they could use to trade for other things, went through a recession which lasted a very, very long time, and which was also perhaps why the nations which engaged in colonialism actually had their economies not grow as fast as the ones which didn't, because they were bringing in resources and they were taking in labor which wasn't theirs necessarily, but they did it in such a way that it did not, in fact, improve their economy overall. And this sort of idea which comes out of these two thoughts of enlightenment, this idea that you can explain everything and you can control everything, that there's nothing outside of what we, with our human reason, with enough effort, with enough thought, could determine, is a totalizing sort of ideology. And the thought is often presented in the idea of the singularity, that you can create a computer which reasons, and therefore you can create one which is powerful enough that reason will conquer all, except that reason has a fatal flaw in it, which is something which when I was about 15 years old, thought I discovered for myself for the first time, but which has been known for centuries, which is that if you go back in time enough times and say there must be a reason for this happening, there must be a cause of this effect, you eventually you must get back, because there's no such thing as just an infinite series of things, or if there is, then that infinite series must itself have a cause for it to be reasonable, because reason is seeking the cause of things. It's to break things apart. It's to find why they are the way they are. But if you go back to the beginning with the Big Bang, which is relatively current theory, or you go back and someone might say, oh, the Big Bang goes on forever and it goes in a circle and it causes itself, or all sorts of funny things to get around this. Or there's been many Big Bangs and then it returns and then becomes another one. You're not getting a cause of that effect. You're not getting what causes that circle. You're not getting what causes that original reaction, which means that reason itself, the seeking of a cause of all things, breaks down, which means that you seeking this answer is seeking an answer to which there isn't an answer, unless, of course, you include something which is not of reason, which is something we cannot discover of reason, an external thing. Now, religion, which is something which English liberalism does not reject, is something which seeks to get that reason, and modern monotheistic religion is very different from the ancient religions, and I'm not including all monotheistic religions in this. You will have some modern monotheistic religions, including a very well-known one, which has a God which is simply a single God among many, in which case the whole atheist trope of you all disbelieve in 10,000 gods, I disbelieve in 10,001, might have some sort of traction. But the God which many monotheists believe in, which Christians believe in, is a God whose name is Yahweh, which means being, which means I am, which means that which exists itself, existence, reality in a sense, and not in the sort of pagan sense of simply something which inhabits all things. It's in the sense of being itself, reality itself, that which causes all other things to be simply by being, which can't itself be brought into being or brought out of being, but simply exists and always will exist. Now, that sort of idea is one which is something which answers that logical question. Whether you believe that is a mind which brings everything into existence or not is a different story and a different question, and which brings us into religion and beliefs in that. But that's an answer to reason, which is not an answer which reason can explain. It's an idea that everything does simply exist, not that everything exists because something else exists. That, yes, it does exist because something else exists, but there must be some sort of underlying thing which exists and always has existed and always will exist and can't change or be influenced by anything else. The eternal, essentially. A concept of a God, essentially. Now, the problem with any sort of ideology based in reason rather than an ideology based in this idea that we are lesser beings, that we are lesser things, is that those ideologies fill in that blank with themselves, fill in their blank with a human being who, looking at the world purely through logic, purely through cause and effect, eventually has to look at the world and realize that even something which is a small threat can be something which takes down an empire. They have to realize that the flapping of a butterfly's wings can cause a hurricane. They have to realize that small freedom becomes a threat. That's why people who are communists will often look at someone who is a libertarian or a classical English liberal and say this person is a fascist or this person is this or that, because they see Enlightenment ideology and beliefs, and they see that it isn't communist beliefs, and therefore they extrapolate and they extrapolate and they extrapolate, and they look at it through the lens of their own history, their own interactions with history as socialists. And they think this could eventually lead to that, and therefore, even though it isn't that, it becomes that. And this is also why anything which can be a threat to someone's position in the world, for instance, a belief in reality which is different, a belief which is a religious belief, or a belief in certain biological aspects of the person, suddenly become a threat because it all has to be gamed out. And instead of saying we can't actually reason to the nth degree, we can't actually do that because reason and logic itself break down. Because when you look at what makes up molecules and atoms, the rules of the larger universe no longer apply. When you look into the origin of all things, you cannot get there with reason. You cannot get there with pure logic, and you cannot get there with the tools of the Enlightenment. And another tool of the Enlightenment is this idea of scientism, this idea of empirical existence being the only sort of pattern you can get. And so you break everything down and nothing else has meaning, but then you give into nihilism, and from nihilism you lose your culture, you lose your beliefs, you lose all of these little beliefs and patterns that your ancestors had, which hold things together in a way that your logical, human, manufactured sort of society simply cannot replace. And the ancients before the Enlightenment had many different patterns they followed. Often these patterns were from biblical sources or religious sources or myths or legends. These are the sort of things which you can't simply quantify, can't simply break up and turn into smaller parts, or find the origin of the origin of the origin. And usually trying to find the origin of things which are 4,000 or 5,000 years old or older is a case where you take the smallest threads and try and build a mountain out of them and get things very wrong. Such as the idea that Genesis came about and the early Bible came about at the time of the Babylonian exile of the Jews, that they invented everything there, except that archaeology discovered a sort of text inside of a good luck type of charm inside of a grave, which showed that in fact parts of that text were certainly in existence long before that, which means that theory was wrong. And yet you have these ideas, you have these ways of looking to the past, and certainty accompanies it. And yet with evolution, for instance, we have animals which just disappear for hundreds of millions of years that we think are extinct, and then we discover them, or we discover them at a later stage, and yet they disappear from the chain because you cannot tell everything about the past from reason alone. You cannot rely on it alone. And when you do, when you become more and more obsessed with cause and effect, you enter in a sort of psychopathy. You don't accept ordinary risks, which most of us accept in order to be humane and good. You eventually become utterly paranoid and utterly logical in your paranoia. The difference between a madman and a person who is ordinary is often that the madman has this closed circle of logic, which is absolute, which must be true, and which can be nothing but true. And they hold on to it. And this is also what you get when you have certain cults and ideas like that. It's not that the logic seems wrong if you play it in the mind. It's often that things are impossible to disprove that get brought about. It's that the logic itself is too small. It's that it doesn't encounter the world as a small little brain encountering something which is much bigger than it, much larger than it. And I remember reading some African literature as part of universities. For instance, you have Things Fall Apart, and the tragic story of Okonkwo within it. And he has this new religion which is taking over everything, but it's not. It's Kipling's idea of the white man's burden, this idea of the British Empire must go out into the world and conquer and control and take over. And often nowadays you're hearing more and more this attack from the left against the Enlightenment, that it's brought about racism and colonialism and slavery. Well, all of those things actually existed and have existed for thousands of years, though it may have highlighted or brought about certain instances of those things. And where it has brought about those, I would say that it comes from this cause and effect sort of thinking, the sort of thinking which leads an empire to conquer lest it get conquered, which leads to ideas such as the very reasonable and rational idea of mutually assured destruction, MAD doctrine, whereby nations like Britain and America will build up more and more nuclear weapons so that if they're ever attacked, they will nuke the country which attacked them out of existence. And that country in turn will probably try and completely nuke them out of existence. The sort of escalation to the nth degree to prevent any sort of conflict, any sort of battle, any sort of chance of battle or war. And that's incredibly dangerous because if you see life as cause and effect, you're likely to become a monster. If you see life as something you don't entirely control and which you can't, even if you had the greatest human mind in the universe, predict, which only that being, that essence God, could actually predict, because you aren't in control, because cause and effect is not the ultimate arbiter. Unless you have that sort of break in the logical cycle, you don't have a mind which is operating on a human level. You have almost a machine, artificial intelligence mind, which just calculates everything. And the idea of someone being calculating is often a negative thing to talk about them being. It's often something you associate with serial killers, murderers, sociopaths, because if you think you can calculate everything, you become a monster. But if, like J.R.R. Tolkien, you view the world in such a way that a lot of things come from that which was before, but some things, many things maybe, come into the world in such a way that they do not follow what was before, and perhaps what follows after them does not follow them. This idea of things not always being cause and effect, that's something which preserves our sanity. Now, you can talk about magical thinking all you want, except that the origin of science in many ways comes from magical thinking, comes from the alchemists, comes from those sort of ideas, and magical thinking is something I reject. But at the same time, we need to be aware that this cause and effect idea of the world, this idea that everything is empirical, everything can be explained by science, is not true. Science is simply a scientific method, and you can't do every scientific experiment imaginable. And even if you could, you can't explain the world perfectly, because our system of reason, which is very important in Western thought, which is something you need to rely on generally as a pattern, it breaks down at its very beginning. It breaks down at the start, at the first cause of an effect. Therefore, it is simply a model of the world, and models of the world are always imperfect. And that's why it's so important to look into our history, into the evolution of ideas and culture, and take those ideas which allow being to continue, which allow our societies, our histories, our ancestors to continue. And in the Western world, that is the Western culture, that is the Western belief system. That is a system which is not just cause and effect, which is a system which is not just us against you, which is a system of something which is more, and which takes into account both the fist of harm and the kindness of mercy, but also one which does not reject its heritage, which does not reject the people who make up its heritage or cause them to reject themselves, which looks very carefully at the things of the past and asks, why was this done before we take them away? And which looks very carefully at the future we want to mold, incrementally, slowly, rather than believing that what's in our mind is larger and more concrete than what's outside of us, the world and being and existence, and the many smaller patterns which we can use to try and figure out the real world, rather than the patterns in our mind where we take things apart to such a degree that nothing stands up to scrutiny and no meaning can exist.